name is Mark Hobart, and I am a catastrophist. And together with my colleague Kola here, we're going to present the 7th video in our series of Essential Concepts videos. And this one is entitled, It's All About You. And it's available on the Caveat Mind YouTube channel, as well as on the EssentialConceptsInc.com website. And the whole focus of this is to focus on the cognitive bias of ego-centric thinking and reaching a consensus. Is to focus on the cognitive bias of ego-centric thinking and reaching a consensus. Mutare fatum, to change fate, is the motto. Cognitive biases are all displayed here. This book, the codex down there, there's a poster that's available on compoundinterest.com, compoundchem.com. The ostrich paradox over here explains how each one of us suffers from egocentric thinking, talks about the kinds of biases we all share, and then finally I'm going to walk through a example of the kind of egocentric thinking through the book Rare Earth, Why Complex Life is So Uncommon. The fundamental purpose of catastrophic thinking is to formulate public policies which will guide us through catastrophes or disasters. To formulate such policies requires society to reach a consensus. A large part of learning is to learn how to think to overcome distractions in our thinking, to think clearly, logically, and objectively, but the greatest distraction we will face is ourselves. Specifically, our thinking is clouded by cognitive biases. There's 180 of them there. But the one that bothers us the most is ourselves. We have egocentric thinking. Our personal experience, what we've observed, clouds our thinking, like availability heuristics, which is rules of thumbs based on what information we've seen or encountered. Aversion to cognitive dissonance, we avoid things that don't agree with what we think. Confirmation bias, we put more weight on things that agree with what we think. The history of egocentric thinking began, well, it didn't begin, but one of the most famous examples is that we, for many, many years, thought that the sun revolved around the earth. That's putting the earth first. That's egocentric, geocentric thinking. Finally refuted. People died because of a misinterpretation of how God thinks and creates. We see the world the way we want to see it. We have history, and the history was Eurocentrism, that is based on Western civilization, emphasis placed on what the Europeans contributed. Jews in Israel, the Judeo-Christian ethic comes from the Bible, because if you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics versus biblical scribes, you can see where the history came from and what we relied on. Capitalism, same thing. We tend to view our version of capitalism. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but keep in mind that we need to realize that most of the world doesn't have American capitalism. And indeed, many segments of our own society do not see it our way. And I refer you to the article by Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The problem with egocentric biases are that it's difficult to reach a consensus. Indeed, you'll tend to form a consensus by gathering your group together and agreeing on your narrative. The false consensus effect, that article right there is pretty good. Policy formation requires a true consensus, not an illusion of a consensus. The red flag is when you and your group all say, everyone knows that. That's a red flag. Groupthink bias is a consensus reached without critical thinking. It is a strong group identity, pressure of conformity. It happens as a bandwagon bias. Get on board the bandwagon. McNamara and others attributed the war in Vietnam to groupthink in Washington. They all thought the same way. The Challenger space shuttle disaster, NASA, they all thought it would work, so they went ahead with it. The characteristics of groupthink There's an illusion of invulnerability, an illusion of unanimity, a pressure to conform, self-censorship. You don't want to disagree with the group. Closed-mindedness, dissent is silenced and suppressed. And here's a real hallmark of groupthink. You see others as weak, stupid, backward, ignorant, unenlightened, inferior, misinformed, irrational, or biased. So we have in America two great groups of groupthink, the left and the right. And each of them views the other as weak, stupid, backward, ignorant, unenlightened, inferior, misinformed, irrational, or biased. That's a problem. It's also a problem for reaching a consensus on so many of today's important issues. Egocentric bias and groupthink. We need to step back and see our own myopia. Perhaps an example that you can all agree on would work as the best example, a best way to see that you're part of groupthink too. For example, everyone knows that there are trillions and trillions of stars, trillions of planets, and probably billions of Earth. So life must be everywhere. That's kind of like what everybody thinks today. Go back and look at the characteristics of groupthink. Do you see your own smugness and arrogance and all the other attributes? If I understand anything about the rare earth was a consensus at one time that based on Judeo-Christian ethics that God created the earth and earth is the center of the universe. And then we came up with modern science, and now we're back to maybe it is pretty rare. Biocentric thinking about life itself. We think we're the forms of life that exist. Geocentric thinking about how what planets are inhabitable and how they're formed. Star Trek was famous as a television show, science fiction television show about Class M planets. They were constantly looking for complex and intelligent life on other oxygen-bearing worlds. But if you look back at Earth's history, you don't see a lot of Class M. Let me explain. Let's look at the history of the Earth. For the first 500 million years, it was molten, a red surface, violently boiling, though everything was a volcano, and the atmosphere was methane and carbon dioxide and a host of toxic chemicals. There was no life. Then we became a pale green sea. There was no land because plate tectonics didn't get started right away. First you had to cover the molten earth with a solid crust. They collected water, and the first habitat that was suitable for life was the base of those seas. So I'll assume that when an environment became available, it was occupied by life. And the first form of life then would have been methane-consuming microbacteria, and it formed microbial mats on the floor of the sea. We have these today. That's the first life form, because I'm going to classify life forms by what they eat to survive. And the first type would have been methane. And then plate tectonics set in. That is that the Earth was continuing to churn underneath the thin surface, and the crust started to break apart into chunks. And those where it was breaking, that's where hydrothermal vents formed. And the hydrothermal vents were very, very hot. The water came gushing up, carrying lots of sulfur, and that became the source of food for the nourishment for the second type of life to emerge on Earth, and that is the sulfur-consuming anaerobic bacteria. And then we go down and we see that the anaerobic bacteria began to eat other things besides sulfur, and the seas turned purple or black, and then some bacterium invented photosynthesis about 2.8 billion years ago on a Wednesday. And that created the fourth form of life on Earth, and that was plant life. And what happened was it would consume carbon dioxide, emit oxygen, and the seas turned red as the oxygen oxidized the iron, creating the sedimentary layers we see now around the world that are red, as they locked in all that iron into the sediments of the earth. Well, the bacteria were too successful. They almost killed themselves by filling the earth with their waste, which was oxygen, and that made the earth cooler instead of a greenhouse gas like carbon dioxide, and the earth iced over. Snowball Earth. And that was from 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago. And the volcanoes had to emerge through the ice caps, ice sheets, and fill the earth with carbon dioxide again. So now there's a boring billion years where cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, dominate in the earth, and we have green slime oceans. Then a bored bacterium invents sex about 800 million years ago. And the predator life forms that we know, vertebrates. And instead of just plants, we now have predators. And predators can include things like rabbits and lions. The rabbits eat the grass, the lions eat the rabbits. Those are all predators. And the Earth became a Class M planet. So, what do we know? The Class M planets are only true. Earth was only a Class M planet for about 10-11% of its history, and vertebrate DNA was less than 10%, 11% of the Earth's biological history of life forms. Humans, of course, are just a blink of the eye. 70,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, we almost became extinct in the most primitive forms, just from the volcano tuba. Catastrophic thinking involves abolishing the self-centered thinking, self-righteous, egocentric thinking. Everything is our planet as it exists today. It isn't. We must respect the points of views of others if we're to reach any kind of consensus, especially the ones we know are wrong. So please support my efforts to be like, subscribe, comment, share, especially subscribe. There's my credentials, copyright, trademark, but please spread the word, share this message and the other messages that are available on my website. And then I'll end every video with a prayer for peace.